directional sweeping, the free guard zone, actual pebble on the ice. There's a lot that we take for granted today, but which didn't exist for most of curling's extensive history. Go back just a few decades and you'll see significantly worse ice conditions, far less precision on shots, and less impact from sweepers. In short, curling is constantly evolving, and with it, so does curling strategy. It might be tempting to think that before a certain time, curling strategy basically didn't exist. When Scots were playing the game on frozen locks with makeshift stones hundreds of years ago, was the game decided by nothing more than random chance? It's hard to imagine the players at the time thought so. And while the game didn't have any of the subtleties and nuances that we take into consideration today, we have to believe that even the earliest curlers had ideas about how to win the game, and that some competitors were much more successful than others. Let's take a look at what we know about curling before the 1800s, and what that might have meant for the strategies of the time. In the earliest days of curling, each team would play with 8 players, each of whom brought 1 stone to the competition. According to John Kerr's History of Curling, written to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Royal Caledonian Curling Club in 1888, the earliest curling rinks were generally not more than 30 yards from tee to tee, far shorter than in the modern game. In addition, the sizes of the house varied. While Kerr seems to suggest that an 8-foot diameter house became standard at some point, he also notes that houses of sizes from 2 to 12 feet in diameter were used at varying times in ancient play. In other words, you might be playing with something akin to the modern house, or trying to draw to a circle barely larger than a modern-day button. There was no such thing as indoor, dedicated ice for curling at this time. In fact, there was no guarantee there would be curling every winter, as a particularly warm season might make it difficult to get the depth of ice that would make such a game feasible or safe, at least in some parts of Scotland. Thankfully for our curling ancestors, the Little Ice Age in the North Atlantic would have prevented this from happening with any frequency in the 17th and 18th centuries, at the very least. The curling of the time was played on ice that had no consistent or predictable curl. I include the words consistent and predictable because it's also nearly impossible to imagine that the ice was usually flat and straight, as anyone who's ever played on rented arena ice, or especially on outdoor ice, can attest that there would have been plenty of runs, hills, and other peculiarities that curlers would have had to figure out each time they stepped on the ice. Then there are the rocks themselves. The earliest rocks, used in the days when curling was likely played more like quoits on ice, didn't have handles. However, they did have niches available for a finger and a thumb, serving a purpose not entirely unlike that of the holes you'd see on a bowling ball today. Players were supposed to throw the rock at least some of the way down the sheet, and they seem to have been thrown in a sweeping, curved motion around one's body. As a result, while we think of most ancient curling rocks as being far heavier than modern stones, these versions, from what we can only really call a proto-curling game, played probably sometime from the 1500s to maybe 1650, ranged from about 5 to 25 pounds. Players likely simply found a suitable rock from a river channel, seemingly preferring those with smooth undersides. Hey, even if the rocks were thrown part of the way, they probably also slid the rest of the way, and in that case, you wouldn't want the random bounces that would come from a rough surface. However, those rocks were only really used until about 1650 or so. Around that time, we begin to see a real big shift in popularity towards rough blocks that have the key component missing from those earlier stones: a handle. Don't be mistaken to think that these are anything like the rocks you throw today, however. The rough block name is accurate, as these stones could come in any sort of shape and size imaginable. Kerr quotes Sir Richard Braun, describing stones of the second era, lasting roughly from 1650 through 1800, as such.
They were of a wretched description enough, most of them being sea stones of all shapes, sizes, and weights, Some were three-cornered, like those equilateral cocked hats which our divines wore in a century that is past. Others like ducks, others flat as a frying pan. Their handles, which superseded holes for the fingers and thumb, were equally clumsy and inelegant, being mal-constructed resemblances of that hooked-necked biped, the goose.
Imagine trying to figure out angles, rolls, and even just drawing ports with rocks like these. How will your triangular rock roll after one of its corners bounces off the flat side of a rectangular one? Can your oblong stone fit through a small port if it happens to go through between two other rocks long ways, making it as narrow as possible? Kerr even outlines an example of this in his book, showing just how much more difficult a situation would be with the old, rough blocks, as opposed to the more modern, more standardized round stones used in the late 19th century. It's hard to imagine that many of these stones would be anywhere close to balanced, meaning players could well know that their rock would tend to spin, drift one way or another, be particularly good at moving or bouncing off of other rocks, and so on. They might not control this with any precision, but it seems presumptuous to think that curlers of these early eras wouldn't notice trends when choosing the rock they wanted to throw. Now, all that said, it's likely that curling at this time was largely a hitting game. One team would try to get a stone close to the pin, and the other team would try to either beat it or replace it. Certainly, the value of a guard would be known, but likely only to protect a rock that already looked like it was going to score, not to preemptively guard an area of the house. It might seem that getting around a guard might be all but impossible at this time, barring a run on the ice or perhaps an unbalanced stone designed to curl in a certain direction, sort of like we might see in bowls or lawn bowling today. However, there may have been a couple of other tricks up the sleeves of curlers even at this time. Kerr notes that curlers could move laterally and make what he called a flank attack to approach the house from an angle. However, he notes that this was, even in these times, a bad form, and we may suppose the player's stone to be coming straight at the house when imagining how curling was played in those days. Kerr also discusses the Fenwick Twist, the technique that we now use today to add rotation to a rock. Even in his time, this was considered advanced technique in Scotland. Good ice was straight ice, and pebbling was not used there, so the amount of curl one could get on such ice, even with the twist, was small. The Fenwick Twist is said to have gotten its name from curlers in, where else, but Fenwick, who were documented using it around 1800. This fact has sometimes been used to suggest that there was no curl in curling before at least the early 1800s, if not even a little bit later. But even Kerr doesn't believe this to be the case, finding it unlikely that the curlers who came earlier didn't realize the impact a rotation would have on a rock. Kerr documents some accounts of what appears to be the twist from the 1700s. This whole topic is even part of the debate over why the game is called curling, a contentious topic that I will definitely be getting into in a future video. Still, sources at this time suggest that while the twist could sometimes help one play around a guard, it was perhaps best used to combat the bias in the ice. Those who play on anything other than dedicated ice today can confirm that this is often the biggest impact of the handle on some sheets. While you may not be able to get the curl you want, you might avoid falling into a run, and that can be what allows you to make a shot. At best, however, this twist must have been a rare and very skillful play in the 18th century and earlier. And while I've outlined a few ways of getting around guards and burying a rock, most curlers probably played in a much more straightforward manner. Big, heavy rocks were popular among many curlers, including the famous Jubilee Stone. Just look at this big heckin' guy. It weighs in at a massive 117 pounds, and for a curler strong enough to get it to the other end of the sheet with some weight left, it would likely remove any opposition, if it didn't simply cleave some smaller or damaged stones into pieces. And once it got into position, good luck trying to remove it. Sweeping existed at this time, but played a far different role than it does today. More likely than not, most of the impact came from literally sweeping debris, snow, or other obstacles out of the way of a stone's path to ensure that it would travel unimpeded towards its destination. As we know from curling in the 20th century, it's not as though sweeping with a corn broom had no impact on the distance a rock would travel or the ability to hold a line. But that impact was far less than with the brooms and fabrics used today. It's fair to say that the impact was even smaller hundreds of years ago, but that the importance of sweeping literal obstacles out of the way was far higher. So if you were to time travel back to the 1700s or so, and had to win a curling match, what strategy should you give your team, likely made up of 8 players, each throwing 1 rock, in order to come out on top? Much of it would depend on the rocks you have. It might be best to have your lead throw one of the heavier stones towards the house. A triangular rock might be best, as these have a tendency to spin rather than leave the house when they're hit by opponents, particularly on their edges. Getting one in the house early was almost certainly the best strategy at this time, as the removal of even a fully open and exposed rock was no sure thing. So without hammer, the goal would be to get as close to the pin as possible. With hammer, you'd want to hit any good stone your opponent put in scoring position, hoping to remove it, or at least push it behind the tee before it could get guarded. Should your opponents have failed to put something in the house, you might draw a little bit off center. Even in these days, the hammer team would prefer to have a larger scoring area and a clear path to the button at the end if possible. Any curlers on your team who know the secret of the Fenwick Twist should be given the smaller stones out of the set your team has brought, as you'll likely prefer them to draw and potentially even curl around guards or other stones with some combination of rotation, using rocks known to list in a particular direction, or the aspects of the ice as you've seen them. However, hitting and throwing rocks as straight as possible will be far more predictable and should be tried whenever it makes sense to do so. If you get a rock in good position in the house as a possible counter, guard it as soon as possible, making your opponent throw 2 or even more good stones to remove it from play. A Herculean task of strength and skill under the conditions of the day. Make sure your player delivering the final rock has their draw weight down, as they may be in a position where their only shot is to outcount what the other team has in the house. And if your opponents get a good rock near the button, please try to remove it immediately before guards make it impossible to do so. To be honest though, the biggest part of being a good skip at the time would have had nothing to do with strategy as we consider it today. A skip wouldn't be overly worried about rock positioning, though they'd certainly have preferences as to where their rock sat. The score, the end, and whether or not they had the hammer would be factors in determining a strategy, but all of those would have been of secondary importance. The skip's main job would be to learn the ice as soon as possible, know his players and their stones, and give them shots according to those factors that they can make to put the team in position to win. And with that in mind, that's something even novice skips can learn from now in the 21st century. All those same skills are incredibly important when you aren't playing the accurate, precise, and high percentage game more competitive curlers might find themselves in. While you should not ignore basic strategic advice, it's far more important today when even recreational curlers will make a lot of basic shots and half shots. You should know the ice and know your players. Doing so will help you choose the shots that will best execute a reasonable winning strategy, even if you aren't always following the by-the-book ideal strategy and tactics we sometimes talk about here. I hope you enjoyed this discussion of what ancient curling strategy might have looked like. I'll try to do more of these in the future, showing how curling strategy evolved into the modern game as we know it today. For now, if you've watched this far, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel in order to get updated when I release new content. If you want to support more videos like this, please check out the Chess on Ice Patreon, where you can get exclusive content, early access to videos like this one, and other benefits in exchange for monthly donations to the channel. Thanks again for watching, and good curling!